Okay, thank you everyone for coming again. And you know what, we really are thankful to our guests that are from other churches outside the CEC. And you notice that I'm surrounded here. There's nobody here on this panel. Actually, none of them are actually from the CEC, although they're all our very good friends. And
are we still saved?
We have our Roman Catholic friends and non-denominational and Presbyterian. And, that's the great thing about it, though, the body of Christ, right? Amen. Being able to hear from others and speak to others. Bishop Bates couldn't be here. He had a question. I'm going to give a brief answer on that question on his behalf, but then we'll get to the other questions in a moment. So, again, this panel is on bioethics. Bishop Bates' question. So, if I get this wrong, just blame him. In the current culture, would you say that it is important for clergy to be educated on bioethical issues? You know what? I can answer that question because I think I wrote the question. It is extremely important, and it's something that I've been emphasizing for years to our bishops and to others that are involved in educating in our seminary, that our clergy especially, be educated on these ever-changing. It's almost like technology. You know, like you get an iPhone today, and 2 years it's a dinosaur. And bioethics, it's the same thing. I mean, we're dealing with so many bioethical issues, and what happens is they become pastoral issues, and that's why it is so important for our clergy to be educated, for our seminary classes to have teachings. We have ethics teaching, but we really need teaching on modern day bioethics. And I have asked, I have some books that I suggested to the seminary committee, and also I spoke last, actually it was at your 25th anniversary in New York, and I met with a friend of mine, Paul Schenck, and he's a Roman Catholic priest, and he does a lot of his work on bioethics. And I've asked him if he would consider, and I would have to talk to Bishop Kessler about this, if he would consider maybe doing one of our online classes, doing some teaching on bioethics. So I mean, this is a very simple answer to that question, but I think it's extremely important. I think you're dealing more now pastorally with these issues, and you really need to know what you're dealing with when you're talking about in vitro fertilization or many other issues that are considered new bioethic issues. Okay, we're really going to wait till after for a question, but if it's a quick one.
Well, are there like online or seminary?
Oh yeah, there are things out there you can do on your own. Yeah, you can check, you can Google things.
Right? Just anywhere. Okay.
Yeah.
That's broad.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, there are, and of course today you can Google anything. You go to the doctor's office and you start telling them what's wrong with you, and you've got a computer and going.
Yeah.
I thought you were supposed to learn that in medical school.
But different moral principles and ethics behind it. So bioethics and bioethics are just a word of caution.
Yes. Well, some of that will be discussed today. So, anyway, so that's basically the answer for that I would give for the question that Bishop
That's a
Bates
yes.
had. Not really researching and preparing, but yeah, absolutely, it's very important for clergy to be educated on different bioethical issues. So the next question will go to Father Frank Pavone. And Father, the question for you is, what would you say are the most critical bioethical issues facing our society today?
Let me start by
referring back to Dr. Bernard Nathanson, whom I mentioned this morning, whose story most of you know, founder really of the abortion industry in the United States. After he became pro-life, he became a pro-life activist. He did a lot to really make up for the evil he had unleashed. As he said, he unleashed the abortion monster on the United States. But then what he did, very deliberately, was he became a bioethicist. He went back to school. And he began giving talks in the early 90s on the question of the bioethical challenges of the 1990s. Let me trace for you some of the issues and then work up to the answer to this question. What's the most critical question, if you will, in bioethics? By tracing some of the things he said way back then, which he said were going to be in the headlines and that we are all living through right now. He said, you know, close on the heels of abortion, of course, there are all the issues dealing with assisted technology at the end of life, and lots of bioethical questions affecting lots of families and people about how long should you attempt to keep somebody alive if in fact the body has an underlying condition eating away at it. Where does one draw the line between responsibility to keep someone alive and not? These are questions that become more complicated the more we are able to do in medical intervention, in particular diseases, in particular conditions. And how much of the technology that we have and that we continue to develop should we in fact use? And then, of course, in the whole area of reproduction, assisted reproduction, of course, infertility is a big problem. So many couples face. It's a big cross. How far can we go in assisting the natural act of reproduction? Can we do things to intervene on the body if the body is having difficulty doing what it's supposed to do, but nevertheless it's still the union of the same two people? Or can we begin replacing that act of union between the husband and wife with some other kinds of intervention? So therefore we have the question of surrogate parenthood. We have the question of sperm and egg donors. We have the question of in vitro fertilization. And of course the complex questions that arise when in doing assisted reproductive technologies, in vitro fertilization, and so forth, you have more newly fertilized lives than you need. And then you end up with literally frozen human beings by the hundreds of thousands that nobody really knows what to do with. Dr. Nathanson traced an astonishing case showing what happens when you go down a moral dead end. Couple in California, married, could not conceive, and therefore they decided to use in vitro fertilization. They ended up having an egg donor, a sperm donor, and the artificial fertilization, and then surrogate parenthood. So they ended up with a child. Okay. Then they got divorced. And so now the question was, whose child is this? The egg donor and her husband? The sperm donor and his wife? The surrogate mother and her husband? Or the parents who ended up adopting the child? And it went to court in California, and the judgment of the court was this child has 8 parents. And you know what happened to the child? He became a ward of the state. Now this is absurd. And it shows what happens when you start tampering with the origins of human life. You really end up down a dead-end road that you really didn't want to go down in the first place. But then it gets further than that, and Dr. Nathanson began tracing what we can do, for example, with our genetics when we come to understand more, as we have, about the genetic code of the human being, and we've been able to map the human genome. So let's say now that we've discovered the gene, for example, that controls sleep. And we can begin, once you find something, then you can begin to modify it, right? So we find the gene that controls sleep. So what's going to happen now? What are we going to do with this knowledge? Are we going to set up clinics where you can go and have that gene altered in your own body? That would be an interesting question, wouldn't it? I want more sleep. I want to have less sleep. Wouldn't it be great not to have to sleep at all? Now, for some people, that's a very attractive option.
For him, he would.
But for others, no. We want it the other way around. Or even just, the modification of any genetic quality for yourself or for your future children. And furthermore, what about the information we obtain from the genome? If someone takes your DNA and they map out everything we can know from your genetics, and now you see you are genetically inclined in 15 years to get this disease, or in 20 years to have this condition. The question is, who has a right to that knowledge? Do you, your spouse, your employer, the state, your doctor? Where does this information go once we get it? It raises incredibly complicated questions. And then, of course, the whole area of not only genetic manipulation, but the combination of genetic material between species and the construction of other species. What if we created a host of beings that had the brute strength of horses, and yet a minimal enough human intelligence to be able to do concrete tasks? Do we hire these people to do our construction work? In fact, are they people at all? Do they have souls if we start combining human genetic material with that of another species? Are these persons? Do they have human dignity if just part of their genetic material is human? It begins to raise questions that really people don't know how to answer. And then, of course, related to all this, and of course this is also something that it's in the headlines, in terms of cloning and stem cell research and the ability to, or the question of whether one could heal diseases by using stem cell material. Well, of course, we know that adult stem cells do have a track record of treating certain diseases. Embryonic stem cells, on the other hand, where you end up taking a human life in order to obtain this cellular material, that does not, in fact, is not proven to be a medical benefit, not to mention the moral outrage of killing a human being. And then finally, Dr. Nathanson would talk about the ultimate combination of computer technology with human DNA, so that you end up having DNA computers of incredible intelligence. And then you start to ask, if you combine that with robotics, what kind of creatures could you create? Would they be some kind of robots who ultimately outsmart humanity and take over? Is this some kind of strange evolution beyond us? All this to say that the bioethical issue above all, which runs through all of this, and which is really what I would say, the foundational bioethical question, all boils down to the same thing. And the question is this: what is the human person? That's the bioethical question. Because when you start to think about, and it starts with abortion, make no mistake, remember, we're talking about a progression here. Once the human being is declared to be not a person, well, then why can't you use the genetic material to do whatever you want to try to improve the world? It all boils down to, is the human person, are some human beings not human persons? The central question, put a different way, is a question that goes like this: is it possible to be a human being but not a human person? And the answer of the church and the answer of the culture of life is no. There is no such thing as a human being who is not a human person. Because if there is, then you can end up doing whatever you want with that being. And that is the challenge of bioethics. To use it, answering the bioethical challenge does not mean saying that all these advances in science, medicine, and technology are somehow bad or tainted or inherently wrong. No, just the opposite. God gives us the knowledge we have about human science and medicine and technology. The key challenge is this: let us advance in the knowledge of the human person, of the human genome, of stem cells, of reproductive technology, of robotics. Let's advance in the knowledge of these things, but let that knowledge always end up serving the human person, not oppressing, degrading, killing, or replacing. Who is the human person? And we know ultimately that we ultimately find the answer to that in the human being who is a divine person, Jesus Christ, because not only does he reveal to us who the Father is, he reveals us to ourselves. He reveals what humanity is. We cannot improve on his plan. So, thank you.
Thank you for your answer. Now you see why it's important that clergy are educated on these issues.
Can we have a follow-up question?
We're going to have those. We're going to do so if you have something to write down your question, or or if you just remember it, we will definitely do that. Sure. Okay. This one is for Troy Newman. Troy, do you think the abortion industry, either financially or ideologically, has had some degree of influence over the development of bioethics in this nation?
The short answer to that question is yes, unfortunately. I'm not the deep philosopher and theologian that my colleagues are here. I like to boil things down just to their root level. And if you've ever been fishing, particularly deep sea fishing, you have those lines that go straight down, for 100 yards or something, and you let that drag go too quick. What happens? It just turns into a big rat's nest, and it takes hours to unwind. So if I could just kind of unwind this rat's nest, the word bioethics, bio meaning life, ethics meaning what you ought to do, and it's an external set of values that are supposed to be embedded into you. So if you go to work for McDonald's, here's our ethics. Our ethics, customer always comes first. And that's not to be confused with morals. Morals are your own personal set of guidelines. You may choose to smoke or not to smoke. It's not necessarily a sin one way or the other, but it's a personal set of standards. And that's not to be confused with principles. The principle of gravity, it's a law of gravity. And so to boil that right down, we must go back to what God's law says. And that is bioethics, life ethics, or life standards comes from the sixth commandment. Or if you're Roman Catholic, it would be the fifth commandment. Thank you. Thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not kill, or thou shalt not shed innocent blood, the most accurate representation of that. And it's a flip side, just like with every other commandment. Thou shalt not murder also means thou shalt protect human life. Okay? Thou shalt not steal means that there is private property rights and that you have ownership of things. And it's the basis for a free market economy. So the Judeo-Christian ethics found in the Ten Commandments is the standard for all life, faith, and practice. Life, faith, and practice is found in the Ten Commandments. That's it. And unfortunately, we have ceded this authority over to the people who have no ethics, the people that say there is no God. And so when you allow Planned Parenthood to get into the realm of ethics, are you kidding me? When they say there is no seventh commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery, it's thou shalt do whatever you want. There's no, again, thou shalt not commit adultery says that there is such thing as marriage between a man and a woman. So anything outside of that doesn't fly. So what is the ethical standard here for Giron? The place that does stem cell research and cloning, the island of Dr. Moreau stuff. We wrote a book in 1999 called Bioethics in an Age of Biotechnology. And I went through all these technologies, and that was, 15 years ago, right? It was crazy then, it's even more crazy now. So we're unwinding this knot. But if you get right back down to the standard of thou shalt not murder, You look at combining human embryos feeding on mouse or cow feeder cells. You say, this is Island of Dr. Moreau. Anybody see that movie? Mm-hmm. There's an old version, a new version with Val Kilmer. It's crazy. Or you get to Gattaca, talk about eugenics, positive eugenics and negative eugenics. Mm-hmm. You know, a world devoid of God, a world devoid of standards, the ultimate law, God's law, gives you all sorts of craziness. But when you simply boil it right back down to the sixth commandment or fifth commandment, thou shalt not murder, it becomes very easy. So what is the standard? What is the ethical position of Geron or all these other companies, big pharmaceutical companies that are feeding off of, literally feeding off of human embryos, buying their kidneys, their brains, their eyes so that we can have new Visine? You know, there's a big article that came out on the 115 forum last week about the reason, and I'm not vouching for the validity of it, but it certainly got my attention. The reason we have a 30% increase in autism in America is because the way we create vaccines in America comes directly from human embryos. When it's like mad cow disease. You start feeding cow spinal columns and brain matter back to the cows who are ruminant animals, you're going to create problems. So, the bottom line of Geron and all these other companies is don't lose money. That's their ethic. Anything else goes. The ethic is don't lose money. God's ethic is this. And I'm reading from the Heidelberg Catechism in closing, and I've looked at the Catholic Catechism. I grew up Catholic. Heidelberg, Westminster, all the catechisms are essentially the same. Okay, when it comes to humanity, bioethics, human beings are creating the image and likeness of God. The Imago Dei, the great Christian doctrine, creating the image and likeness of God. So anything we do to, I'll just read it here. It says, what is God's will for us in the sixth commandment? I'm not to belittle, hate, insult, or kill my neighbor. Not by my thoughts, my words, my look, or gestures, and certainly not by actual deeds. And I'm not to be party to this in others. And that also applies to the government. Okay? So anything that belittles, destroys, weakens humanity is found in the sixth commandment and prohibited in it. And the flip side is that we're to enhance and lift up our brothers and sisters and encourage them in the love of Jesus Christ. That's unwinding the knot. Amen. Just that simple.
Amen. Amen. Okay, Ryan, this question is for you. You have done several media campaigns regarding the practice of eugenics within the abortion industry, specifically in the African American population. Do you think the bioethical issues we've discussed today perpetrate the practice of eugenics, and if so, how?
Yes, everything that we perceive today, the situation that we see, bioethics situation, I thought Ramon spoke about so articulately, have to be looked at in the lens of history. And you look at the history of eugenics, Galton and even louder.
Yep.
When you look at the history, even you look at Darwinian theory, which was espoused by Galton, and you look at Malthusian theory, for instance, of overpopulation, and how do you advance humankind with your current understanding of medicines that are available and practices that are available at your fingertips. And so when you look at today's situation with Planned Parenthood, for instance, and the injustice of abortion, it's impossible to look at that without understanding first and foremost the foundational issue is population control. And so when I hear bioethics, which I would say during college, high school, college, grad school, never really heard that term at all. And then coming into hearing that often over and over, Peter Singer, bioethicist from Princeton University, and he would talk about post-birth abortion, up to 2 or 3 years, because you're not really a person unless someone deems you a person until you're 2 or 3 years old. I started reading more about this. I thought, this is crazy. But to me, it all comes down to the same thing. We give so much more credibility to some outfit that, uses science It's scientific, therefore it must be, well, one, I think too many people think it's moral. Two, I think too many people think that they're right. And so when you look at bioethics and you look at the history of eugenics, it's all the same thing. It's a particular group of people who have somehow deemed themselves above all others to say that these advances advance humankind. But there again, they are determining who is human enough and who isn't. And those who are brown in this country may have a slight recollection of, and all of us do, of what this country has gone through in our civil rights play. And you look at the history of eugenics, the whole purpose behind it being this whole Darwinian theory, although it's kind of odd, because you have Darwinian theory that is, survival of the fittest, but yet we're going to help along that natural process by unnaturally determining you cannot reproduce and you cannot reproduce, but oh, you can. So a few years ago, 2009, when we launched our campaigns, I didn't really have bioethics in mind. I just figured this is an ethical thing to do, to talk about. It's not okay that black babies are aborted at 5 times the rate of the majority population. It's not okay that we have 1.21 million being aborted of any race or ethnic background. And so when we launched these, little naive us, I had no idea all the things that we would be thrown into. Nor do we know all the things that we were going to learn. But it still, to me, would come down to the same thing. And it comes down to personhood. Because as long as man or woman can determine who is a person, at what point they become a person, it doesn't matter what medical advances you have, you still have the problem that someone is able to determine your personhood.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think of 1857, the Dred Scott decision,
Yep.
and I think of 9 people. In fact, that still blows my mind. 9 people who have the power to really direct an entire nation, to say, you are not human enough. So the Dred Scott decision obviously was a 7-2 decision, just like Roe v. Wade, where they determined that black people are not, they're not persons. The Constitution doesn't apply to them. They can be bought, sold, traded, or killed, which is why Roe v. Wade and that decision are so aligned, because it's the exact same reasoning.
Yep.
But see, the problem is, as you were talking about, if the foundation is not biblical, if things are not rooted, no matter what field it is, I don't care whether it's bioethics, I don't care, whatever field it is, if it is not rooted in immutable truth, nothing else matters. And so here in the black community, you talked about clergy and pastors. Over the years, I've met with a number of pastors, many of whom were completely resistant to any kind of pro-life ideology, wrote it off completely. And here we have a day and age when medical advances assure us of much longer lives. Okay, we have better access to healthcare than we've ever had in the history of humankind. And in the black community, you have better access to medical care than ever before in America. Although the lie is that they still don't have access to medical care. And here, which is interesting because as reproductive health care advances, you have the contention that the reason why black women have more abortions is because they don't have access to health care. But if they're accessing the abortion clinic at 5 times the rate of white women, they clearly have access to some kind of health care. But this is the stuff that's pushed off. And so I just want to play a little clip here from, hopefully this will play, I'm used to a big screen, but I just want to play this clip because when you talk about bioethics, it's impossible to talk about it without Planned Parenthood being at the forefront of determining what that means for so many people. So I'll just hold this up, a little show and tell here. Hopefully you can hear it. Let me put this. Back in 2010, when we launched the first campaign, there were several campaigns launched thereafter. There were efforts by Dr. Johnny Hunter, Dave Gardner, Alveda King, and others to highlight abortion's disproportionate impact in the black community. Planned Parenthood, I love this, because it's completely a David versus Goliath sort of thing. Here we got organizations that are tiny, have next to no money, which is pretty much the norm with pro-life organizations, being a threat to $1 billion giant. So they produced this documentary. It's called The Vital Service. I'm sorry, you have to squint your eyes to see this. Is there any way to turn the lights off temporarily, maybe?
Sure.
Okay. But this gives you an idea. Now, this is Planned Parenthood. It features all African Americans, which I don't like hyphenations because we're all American. But anyway, this is about the campaign, TooManyBorder.com, and I guess they felt sort of threatened that they had to include this, and they produced this 20-minute piece. This is just a snippet, but I want you to understand, too, how some of these pastors, several of whom I've met, not this individual in particular, but the resistance to embracing true health care that is available, which does not end in the death of either the unborn child or the mother.
Millions of Americans have stories. So we got on a bus, brought a camera, and let people speak for themselves. We listened to patients, to healthcare providers, to those who have been on the front lines, and those worried about the next generation.
I said, no, this is a really tough decision. And there were some tears. But I actually left the procedure going, this is the best decision for me. 3 kids is a good number. I only have so much lab space. I only have so much body space. I only have so much time in the day.
And they're all over the country. And you may know that there are forces out there that have been trying to destroy Planned Parenthood. We saw one of those forces not too long ago, and you know that I was involved when they put some billboards right over here off of I-75 that says black children an endangered species. But we are not a species. We are God's children, created in God's image. Planned Parenthood. It helps me to be a better pastor.
Oh, yeah.
So here, when you want to talk about bioethics, not even having a basic understanding of science or life sciences, yes, we are a species. We are the human species.
Lights.
And we are one human species. And here you have a pastor, Reverend Timothy McDonald. If you couldn't hear it, he says, Planned Parenthood makes me a better pastor. And what they regularly do is pass off junk as if it's scientifically sound. And we have these medical advances. Like, for instance, they always talk about maternal mortality and how abortions apparently led to much lower maternal mortality. And of course, in the early part of the 20th century, we're talking about, you know, the rate was over 498 per every 100,000 women. And it was exponentially higher. But what lowered that? Does anybody know particularly what changed maternal mortality?
Washing our hands.
Prenatal care.
Antibiotics, yeah, penicillin. And that may have too, but it was mostly penicillin and antibiotics that radically changed that. But what they do is they don't embrace science, they embrace the alarmism that and the propaganda that somehow abortion reduces infant mortality, it reduces maternal mortality. And here we have access to all of this science out there, and yet, as Troy mentioned, you're talking about an ethical standard. And what is the ethical standard mostly being pumped into the black community? One, as you saw, and may have seen, these are some of the billboards that we placed. Fatherhood begins in the womb, several of these billboards, and of course, Black and Beautiful, one of the billboards. And what is being pumped mostly into the black community? And that is that the standard itself, particularly when it comes to family, is that anything goes. And so we've seen a culture of abortion that has, you know, Roe v. Wade, we're told all the time, has empowered women, but it's empowered men to have sex and run. And so we see this mass this abandonment by men. And so what we have is a standard that so many in the black community, you hear them espouse it at times, particularly some pastors, but there's no real embrace of it. And so when we talk about the numbers, when we speak in some black churches, and people are so blown away by the numbers, and then you tie it historically to this fight for personhood, some people get it. I'm not saying that personhood is the silver bullet. I'm not saying that at all. But in some communities, it resonates. And it's amazing when you have an understanding. You see what eugenics did throughout the early part of the 20th century. It's alive and tragically well today. I mean, people passed off all of these scientific advances as scientifically sound, ethically. You had the American Eugenics Quarterly, which had some of the worst can I say it nicely? It just had a whole lot of garbage in it that was passed off as science. And so my heart right now, through the Reyes Foundation and others that we partner with, and it's not our sole focus. I mean, we were about abolishing abortion because it impacts all of us, but desperately reaching into the Black community to understand things that are scientifically sound, to understand that the advances in science mean that it can be a healthier community, and that abortion is never part of that solution. And so all the things that we've talked about, all these different advances, it's really hard to even get to that area when you have some of the basics that are being completely rejected out of fear, completely being rejected because of politics. And so sometimes you just have to start at square one. And so our campaigns, which began in 2010 and will resume this fall, are going to continue to try to get to those basics so we can get to more of the advanced stuff, so that people understand that there is a far higher ethical standard that we all have to adhere to advance all humankind. So.
Thank you, Ryan. This is a quick question. Does anybody know what country has the best infant mortality rates in the world?
Isn't it Cuba?
Ireland.
Yeah, I was going to say.
No, or at least they're one of
Yeah.
cool where they have no abortion.
It's not
As long as you make sure you're comparing apples to apples.
Right.
Sorry?
If you're comparing apples to apples, different countries compile their statistics differently. And in many countries, a child that's born and then is in a high-risk pregnancy and dies 20 minutes after the delivery is scored as a stillbirth and is not a child mortality statistic. Whereas in the U.S., we would invest enormous resources in trying to save the life of that child, and then that child would be counted as a child that was born who then died. Whereas other countries, it's like, okay, this child is dead, we're going to count them as they never was living. So you got to be very careful with that.
Fair enough.
that you're counting.
I'm just quoting my good friends from Ireland that, and if they were here, they could probably answer you back. I'm not sure I could at this point, but point well taken. Okay. Janet Morana, question for you. If your book, Recall Abortion, in your book, Recall Abortion, you go into great detail about the process of in vitro fertilization. Could you explain could you explain that process here and why it's problematic?
Well, the title of the chapter in my book is Children Made to Order, and I think that kind of gives you the whole concept. And basically we're talking about couples who marry, and of course they're probably contracepting before they marry because they cohabitated, and now because they're trying to get the perfect thing of let's get a house first, fully furnished, 2 cars, and all the perfect atmosphere, we're not going to have children right away. So they continue using the pill for who knows how many years, and then suddenly they decide we're going to have a baby. So we'll stop taking the pill. Well, guess what? They begin having difficulty getting pregnant. Well, why? A whole host of reasons. First of all, the biggest reason is they've thrown away the best years of their fertility. Years ago when couples got married in their early 20s, it was very easy, weren't contracepting, they had families. I grew up in Brooklyn where the average, I have 3 brothers and sisters growing up. My mom had 2 miscarriages, so we would have been a family of 6, but the average family in my neighborhood had 6, 8, 10, 12 children was very common. Children were a blessing, but then, of course, in came contraception. And so what's happened now is couples are getting married later, into the maybe late 20s, even into the 30s and 40s, and they start off with the pill because they want to have a perfect family, but then, boom, they can't get pregnant. And so instead of doing it the more natural way, there's a thing called naprotechnology. It's been developed by Dr. Tom Hildreth of the Pope Paul VI Institute. And what that does is that naturally looks at the man and the woman as to why they're having difficulties conceiving. And it looks at their reproductive system, and he deals with it in a very natural way. But of course, that's not the route that most people go down. They go to these average doctors, these infertility doctors, and what they do is they sell them on the idea of IVF, or in vitro fertilization. Now, in vitro fertilization, there's a lot of things that happen, but as you know, what you're doing is you're collecting the sperm and the eggs separately, and then they're basically being conceived in a petri dish, basically. For the woman's side of things, First of all, the procedure is very expensive. For each attempt at this, we're talking anywhere from $10,000 plus, and insurance companies do not cover it. Okay, so now they're spending $10,000 or more for a procedure that's probably going to fail the first few times they do it. Some couples spend anywhere from $20,000 to $40,000 to have a successful pregnancy. I'm going to get onto that in a second. In order to collect the women's eggs, what they do is they give her, inject hormones into it to get her to hyperovulate so that she's producing even more eggs than normal. And they remove those eggs, and then of course they begin to take a certain amount of the eggs and a certain amount of the sperm and create embryos. For each IVF procedure, they put anywhere from 4 to 6 embryos inside that woman's uterus, because the idea is that they all will not take, right? And you all heard of Octomom, right?
Yeah.
You know, that was so unethical. You know, he put in 8+ and 8 took. Well, anyway, from the 4 to 6 embryos that they'll implant, then of course, you know, they wait to see, and hopefully she'll have a few embryos stick. And now there's success. We're pregnant. Now what happens between the 14th and 16th week, let's say she's conceived now twins or triplets. The same doctors that helped her get these babies and get pregnant now ask them, the couple, would you like to selectively reduce your pregnancy? It's very common.
Yep.
It is happening in hospitals all over the United States. Where I am in New York, for example, Mount Sinai Hospital and some other big hospitals are selectively reducing pregnancies. There's a story in my book where a couple conceived twins, and the wife said, I only wanted one baby. And she told her husband, either we terminate, you know, selectively reduce by one, or I want to terminate the entire pregnancy. And this man was faced with either save one or save none. And the story actually was in an article in the New York Times, the 2-1 pregnancy, and it was very tragic. But this is happening all the time. And then what you might say, well, then what happens to the embryos that they didn't use in this particular attempt? Well, they're frozen. And now couples have to pay the companies to hold on to their embryos, all right, for X amount of years, because they might want to maybe in 2 years go through another procedure and try to get pregnant again. So now these children are left, you know, frozen, and then eventually guess what happens? Now if the couple decides we're going to stop paying, now they then belong to the lab who has those embryos. And of course I'm sure that's where some of this embryonic stem cell comes from. But do you understand what's happening here? First of all, the woman is given these drugs to hyperovulate, so that goes back to what we talked about yesterday, how harmful the pill is for women. Again, cancer-causing, high doses of estrogen are dumped into her, so that's already a risk factor. But the bigger problem is that you're creating life in a false way in a lab, and then children are being discarded. You know, even if they're so, you know, good morals, you know, and they say, oh, no, we're not going to selectively reduce. Well, but you still have a certain amount of children that if he implants 6 embryos and she's pregnant with twins, well, what happened to the other 4? They died. You know, children died. And no one's even counting that. I mean, it's not even being considered. The sad thing about, I think, IVF is that there are good Christian and Catholic couples that are going down this IVF road. Why? They don't realize it's not ethical. They have no clue. Why do they have no clue? Because the pulpit is silent about this. When was the last time you heard a preaching or a teaching or something in a bulletin or a church, anything, about the moral problems of going down the road of IVF? It's silence. And the most shocking thing for me was just recently, I caught up with some friends I hadn't seen. We raised our kids together when they were in grammar school, and these 2 ladies, I hadn't seen them in over 12 years, and we got together for lunch. And over lunch, I gave them, I was so excited, my book. And as we were leaving and saying goodbye in the parking lot outside the restaurant, the one girl said to me, oh, please pray for my daughter Janet and her husband, and Ron and I, we're going off to Turkey next week. I said, why are they going to Turkey? Oh, you know, poor Amanda hasn't been able to conceive in over 10 years that they've been married, and they're going to go get an IVF procedure because it's so much cheaper to get it done in Turkey than here in the United States. And I'm standing there, they're holding my book, and I'm just saying, did you ever think about what's happening in this process? Well, no, but Amanda really wants to have a baby. I said, well, you already bought your plane tickets and you're going, so please don't read the certain chapter of my book till you come back from Turkey. You know, because you're gonna, and of course, what's happened to this girl is now picture this, plane tickets, mom, dad, husband, wife, 4 plane tickets to Turkey, plus whatever they're paying in Turkey. They just came back from Turkey and the procedure wasn't successful. And then the doctors in Turkey told her, well, why don't you come back in 2 months and we'll try again. Is this insane? Think about this. Well, I hope now she's reading the chapter that she's back from Turkey. But what I'm saying is, what I'm trying to make you aware of, there are probably people in your churches who have done this or are thinking of doing this, and they're not understanding, A, the moral implications, obviously, but then also for the physical damage to the woman of taking all these drugs that they're going to give her. And here's another FYI. Guess what's happening on college campuses? There are companies that are offering young girls big money to harvest their eggs. And they're preying on these college students because these are the same kids who have big college loans, and they can make up to 10 grand by going through a harvesting procedure. And it's happening on college campuses all over the United States. Teresa Tomio and I did a whole program on this on our Catholic View for Women show called Weird Science. It's happening. So if those of you who have young ladies going off to college, you better warn them. Because they put up these posters and it's put up like, what help making your tuition women come to a seminar? And they give them a little talk. The next thing you know, they're signing on the dotted line. Once they harvest their eggs successfully, they get a nice fat check, and then they can put it right towards go to the bursar's office and make a big fat payment on their tuition. Up to $10,000, depending on, how often they do it and all that. It's a scary thing, but it's happening, and nobody's talking about it.
This is also with hyper ovulation
Yeah.
techniques?
Oh, yeah, they're also giving them drugs, yeah. Yeah, they're giving them injections, it's the whole thing. They give them the injections, then they give them an appointment, and then they harvest their eggs. And some girls, they'll harvest their eggs once a year, because you figure it's a great way to lower your tuition bills. So, I guess, Father Terry, that pretty much answers the question. It's very sad, but the problem is most people don't realize it's happening. So you
Yeah.
really need to be talking about it.
And it just, all of these answers have, again, kind of pointed us back to the first question about why, or is it important that clergy are educated on these things? Because it certainly is critical. It's critical. It's not just important. It's critical that clergy be educated. Okay, what we're going to do now is we're going to have some time for questions, but we're going to do like we did yesterday. You can ask one question, and so make your question good until we make sure that that everyone that wants to ask a question gets to ask one. And so, who has a question? We'll do the lottery here now. Okay. Well,
Yeah,
you were going to ask earlier, and then I'll get to you. Okay.
Well, it's kind of changed since I've heard the patent.
Okay.
But I go back to the bioethical question. We sometimes think it started when abortion became legal. Or sometimes that seemed like that in the late 80s, early 90s. But I answer this by saying that my pastor, and I met some other pastors that came to the church, and they introduced themselves. This is Pastor so-and-so, this is my wife, this is my 15-year-old child, this is my 14-year-old child, this is my 12-year-old child. Boom. Boom, that's it. You see, in the church, we have bought the ideal that we know when to tell God, we only want 3 children. We only want 2 children. We don't want you, God, to control that part of our lives. Until we deal with that question, we don't have the answers for all these other questions.
Well, that's what the panel was about yesterday.
Was it?
We talked about contraception and the whole issue
Yeah.
that you're discussing.
But it's
So
the
very
mindset
critical,
of
yeah.
a child. It isn't just contraception. It's the mindset that in our church, there's one family that have 10 children, and the question is very often, are them all yours?
Yeah.
I mean, you know what I'm saying? It's the mindset in the church, in my own children.
Oh, yeah.
My own grandchildren tell me, I don't want a child right now. I just got married and I don't want a child right now.
Amen.
So I guess until you deal with that issue, we're not going to have the answers to all this. Now, we can deal with them and go back and forth, but in the church, in my mind's eyes, we've already give up the fight because we have lost the idea that children are a blessing to the scriptures.
You know, what you're saying reminds me of a young mother I met in the course of my travels. She's got 9 children, and she's Roman Catholic. And she said, "Father, I got so many questions when the whole family would be in the shopping center, that I made a T-shirt, and the T-shirt says, 'Before you ask, yes, they're all mine. Yes, I'm Catholic, and no, I'm not going to stop.'" I also interviewed a mother of 20 children who said, I said, "Well, you know, many people are going to ask you, how do you do it?" And she said, "Father, the more children, the more love."
Oh.
It doesn't become harder, it becomes easier.
Jason, just one quick follow-up, just one question. A lady friend of mine, or this family I know, they have 11 children. And she made a statement once. She says, every time that I became pregnant, I viewed it as God, as the Lord visiting me. And she says, what a difference when you see your pregnancy as the Lord visiting you, then it isn't become a problem.
Yeah.
And I just put that out there.
Amen. Yeah, and I want to say that we have, at this conference, this convocation, we have several children over there, youth over there. Their parents are here. The mother is in the Guinness Book of World Records for the most cesarean births ever in history. She's had 11 kids, and most of them are here at the conference. So we consider those children a blessing. Amen. Back there. Okay.
Yes, I'm sorry, I didn't get your name.
Troy Newman.
Troy. I heard you say that 30% of vaccines, but I want to know if this is really factual, that 30% of vaccines that are made in the United States today are made from human embryos. Is that really a fact, or is that, I mean, do you have support for that?
If you give me your email address, I'll forward you this report. The statistic I was quoting said that there's a 30% increase in autism rate in America based on the fact that many of our vaccines are generated from human fetuses and human embryos.
Right.
Aborted babies.
I know that I'm a nurse, and I am a big proponent of getting your children vaccinated. I know a lot of people aren't, but there are a lot of diseases that are coming back, so I think we're foolish to say don't do it. But on the other hand, you know, it was the thiomersal which is a mercury-based piece that was put into those vaccines, the DPTs and those sort of things, years ago, that they did kind of link to the autism. But that guy in England who made that study, that doctor, has been absolutely squished. He did not do proper, if you remember when autism was linked to all those vaccines, his methods were not kosher, okay? But even so, it was the thimerosal that did do the damage, or they thought was doing the damage. And today, the vaccines do not have thimerosal, and that doesn't have anything to do with embryos. So I wonder, what is the connection from the embryonic, if that's the case? I didn't know that either. I mean, the CDC in Atlanta has vaccines. They have, from years ago. Jonas Salk in the 1950s did certainly not use human embryos to make his polio vaccine that wiped out polio in America. Today it's coming back because people are not getting their children vaccinated, as well as diphtheria. And it killed thousands of children years ago. So, you know, we're in that set now that you're not going to vaccinate your children because they might be made of human embryos, which I totally agree, that's terrible. I didn't know that, if that's really the fact. But you can't say you can't do the vaccinations either, because children die from those diseases. So what is the difference? You have to have life, and if America has made those available, and people in
Let me
third
an-
world countries would love to have those vaccines.
Let me answer that question, because I see the heart of your question. And now, number one, I don't claim to be an expert on
I understand that.
vaccination, and that's not the issue in which I'm speaking to. The issue in which I'm speaking to is the fact that abortion clinics sell human embryos to pharmaceutical companies and teaching universities around the world. These babies are being harvested, and why? So that we can create better medicines, better therapeutic techniques, and vaccinations. You're pulling up the report there. It was on the 115 form. And I was simply citing a study that I just read
Right.
last week that related the increase in autism rates to the vaccines that were generated from human embryos. That's unethical. That's immoral. It's against God's law. So that's my point. Now, I'll get to it in just a minute. Am I saying that the vaccine shouldn't be done? No. We have people, like I said, third world countries that are literally dying
Right.
for vaccines, dying for simple antibiotics.
Right.
And to comply with the sixth commandment, according to the catechism that I read, both the positive side and the negative side, we ought to do everything to enhance human life. And that includes giving them proper medications that would enhance their life and diminish disease. So does that answer your question?
Yeah,
And
I do
I'd
want
be
to
happy-
see it though. I would like to see it
Yeah,
and
I
find
think
out who
Troy
the drug
said when
companies
he,
are. I mean,
when he mentioned that, I think he said that he didn't verify that.
yeah, I thought he said that too.
Yeah, he
That's
did.
why I asked.
I do have
He
the
said he
report.
read it, yeah.
It's a scientific study. We do use vaccines that come from human embryos.
Yeah, there's
I
no-
find that repulsive.
Well,
And I
I do
mentioned it
too.
going back to the BSE
Aborted.
scandal of mad cow disease. When you start feeding ruminant animals their own body parts to increase the protein, to increase the milk production, why do you think that we got mad cow? It's an abomination. You go back to Scripture, you're not allowed to do that. So it just goes back to Scripture.
Okay.
Thank you.
Here, yes.
I just want to say, one, that this has been fascinating, thank you all. Two, what's so terrifying about everything is Pandora's box has been opened, and you have on this side immutable truth versus bazillions of dollars. Hello.
Yeah.
What, if anything, could be done to, how do you put Pandora back in the box? Against corporations, drug companies, making unlimited amounts of money, and they have now been declared by the 9 to be persons.
Putting the pen, anybody want to tackle that?
I'll take a stab at it. You can't. I
You
mean,
can't.
the moment
So-
Eve ate of the apple, Adam and Eve unleashed every murder, every rape, every lie, every extortion, every act of violence, just unleashed it. But we believe in the sovereignty of God. He's going to come again to recreate the heaven and earth. He regenerates us body and soul. So we continue to preach the gospel.
Right.
That the answer that God has laid out is the gospel of Jesus Christ. The second one is go back to the first one.
Well, I mean, how do
That's
we
it.
help our society? Obviously, it was
Well,
more a rhetorical statement.
Well, basically, I think everyone leaving this conference, you're under an obligation. You've learned a lot in 2 days. But you have to decide what you're gonna do with that information. You're just gonna go home and say, oh, this was really great, or are you gonna start correcting people in a kind way?
Each one teach one.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I do some of my greatest teaching at the beauty parlor when I'm getting my hair dyed, you know? I get my roots taken care of. And literally, I'm known as, here comes the pro-life Catholic girl, and when people have questions, guess what? They ask me. One time, I had this whole thing, like the girl rinsing my hair was going, she whispered to me, I heard you telling them about the pill, and my doctor wanted to put me on the pill because I have heavy periods, Janet. Should I really do that? And I told her the information, and she was like, oh, I'm not going to let him do that now. So what I'm saying is, you have to take those opportunities and talk about it among the people you can influence. You don't have to wait for your pastor to get into the pulpit. You've got a pulpit among your friends. Every group you belong to, whether it's your Bible study, whether it's the nail salon. I saw a lot of painted toes during this conference, okay? And ladies, a lot of conversation happens at the nail salon where you're getting those pedicures. And I'm telling you, I do a lot of educating at the nail salon and the beauty parlor, you know, besides when I'm giving talks. Because it, like you just said, it's at one-on-one because they're trusting you. You're doing your girlfriend talk. Well, get out there and do your girlfriend talk.
Okay,
That's what you
I'll
need
get
to
to
do.
you, Steve, just a second. I just want to throw in one other little thing about how we, I know it's impossible to get Pandora back in, but I do believe that we're called, there's a sense that Christians are called to reverse the curse. And I believe that rehumanizing those, whether it's an embryo or a baby in the womb, the attempt to dehumanize human beings, persons, has been they've been very successful in doing that. We have to rehumanize them. Yes. Part of the reason we do the liturgy for the preborn out there is to give humanity to those disposable, to what society would call disposable babies. They throw them, they put them in dumpsters, and they put them down garbage disposals. We say no, they're human beings that are worthy, they're persons worthy of a time of prayer and honoring their brief life. And we did the liturgy for the preborn at a center in a research center in Virginia Beach, Virginia, where they were creating embryonic stem cells to destroy and to use as, for embryonic stem cell research. They were creating them. So we went there and did the liturgy for the preborn. And you talk about people thought we were crazy. But we said, no, you're destroying little human beings. And we're going to pray for them just like we would pray for a 6-week-old embryo or a 16-week-old baby in the womb or whatever it is. So we have to rehumanize. We have to say we are the ones that declare their persons, just like it goes back to what Troy said. So that's just one way, and again, it's just part of it. Let me get Steve first, and then.
That's a theological question. In the beginning, you talked a lot about some of the very far-fetched sci-fi stuff that's going on in bioethics and where it's going, and mixing with species and whether a person is considered human person or not versus human being. And just in terms of, there's this other question related to a human person in the image of God is, the question of, when there's a soul. When is a soul infused into a person? When does a person, a human person, receive a soul? Okay, and does that make them different? Right? And with all this far-fetched sci-fi things, is there a point, perhaps, in the creation of beings? Is it possible that God would not infuse a soul, or is a soul an automatic thing?
Yeah, that's precisely one of the theological dilemmas created by these bioethical bizarre practices and possibilities. Of course, the common teaching held across the Christian world, and especially now that we know more about the biology and genetics of how a unique individual life starts, the common teaching is when a human being begins to be a human being, biologically, genetically, they have a soul, because a human being is body-soul unity in Christian anthropology. Body-soul unity, and therefore at fertilization. As soon as that unique life begins, biologically, that soul is there. Now, it is, as you say, and again, as Christian theology teaches, the body, the physical material, of course, is passed on, generation to generation, but not the soul. The soul is not passed on. The soul is directly, for each unique individual, directly created by God at that time of fertilization. Right. So therefore, if you start to tamper with this genetic process, and you end up having what you look at, and even on the biological level, you say, gee, this is human, but it's not. I'm not quite sure. Could God, these are the questions precisely that we're forced to wrestle with. We don't know the answers. I think that theologians would tend to say, theologians who are in our tradition, they would tend to say, well, if biologically that you can say this is human, then you have to presume this human has a soul. This is a person, has to be treated with human dignity. And in fact, going back to something we said yesterday about abortifacients, if you're not sure, what do you have to do? You got to treat that being as if it were a person, even if you have a large measure of uncertainty.
Amen.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah, I just wanted to speak to the vaccine issue really quickly. Is Children of God for Life, COG4life.org, has a lot of information about this. When we were praying about vaccines for our children, we did investigate to find out which ones that were derived from fetal lung tissue, and that would be Varivax. And that's the chickenpox vaccine, which I'm telling you, people won't die from chickenpox, but I mean, nobody wants their child to have to endure it, but if it's the difference between giving them something that's derived from fetal lung tissue, I'm sorry, kids. We're going to have some chickenpox parties. We're going to try to get some the natural way, but our kids aren't vaccinated. And
What's that site again?
it's Children of God for Life.
Actually, it's COG, here's the URL, if you can see it, cogforlife.org. And the specific vaccine information and links to all kinds of studies is there.
I had plenty of, my
this is the whole
pediatrician,
URL.
they ask me every time, will you get this vaccine? I tell them, you don't need to keep asking me, but if that's the law, you keep asking me, I'm gonna keep saying no. But one of the nurses said to me, I don't know why you're rejecting this. I said, because it's derived from fetal lung tissue. And she said, you can't believe everything you read on the internet. And I said, have you read the pamphlet insert? She said no. I said, read it. She read it, and she walked out of the room.
Here's
See,
one
that all
thing.
comes back to what I said, you gotta read those pamphlet inserts.
One thing I just wanted to add to that is one of the reasons why content from aborted fetus is used from fetal lines is because it's cheaper. It's much more readily available. So that is the issue you were talking about. I think actually there's an article, a great article. I can't give you the whole URL on lifesitenews.com. Go to LifeSite News and simply type in MMR autism,
Right.
and you will see a new study that supposedly debunks this. But you will see a researcher who tells you that they're not comparing the same things. They're not comparing apples to apples. And it's a Japanese. Well, there are certain Japanese vaccine that does not have the fetal tissue or fetal substance in it, and but it's much more expensive to produce. That's why they don't use it.
Which goes back to my point, the only unethical thing a company can do is lose money.
That's the truth.
We got one more question. So, who's Patty? You have a question?
Well, maybe just to kind of bring it back to where we started from, like when you, with your question about, the importance of, priests and the clergy and all of this. Like when Janet she was talking a lot about, in vitro and, mentioning the fact, you mentioned like people that desperately want to have a baby. So what I'm trying to say is like, that priests, that have to counsel these people, it's not like these people are thinking, I'm going to destroy embryos, They're thinking, I desperately want to have a child, and you're trying to counsel it. And also, that in vitro is, I don't think anybody mentioned, the kind of the eugenics aspect of this too, but, that in vitro is also used, if a family has, we used to show this film in high school about a couple who had a child that had Tay-Sachs. And Tay-Sachs is a fatal disorder for children. The baby will die when it's a year or two old. They had a child that had Tay-Sachs. I mean, what a horrible thing. So they wanted to have more children. So they did in vitro. So, they test the embryos. And they said in the film, it says something like 3 out of the 5 embryos, did not carry the gene, for Tay-Sachs, and they implanted these embryos back in the woman, and, she had a healthy baby. And then I always tell my students, but hey, they didn't say anything about what happened to
To the
those
other
other
two
two
babies.
defective,
Exactly.
embryos and things
Right.
like that. But, as priests and clergy, when, a couple like that would come to you and say, we don't want to have another child, that we know is going to die and things like that. So just to kind of go back to the.
So it's absolutely critical
It's not quite
that
so.
clergy
It is
are
cut and dry.
educated on these issues. They're very, very, it's not just important, it's critical. And I can promise you, you'll see more from in the CEC. We'll have these on videos, YouTube, and I would really suggest showing these to people and pointing out some of the things that have been said here today and the points that have been brought up. Do you have something?
Well, I always like to leave you with a positive note. That's in the last chapter of my book. But anyway, I heard a lot of people these 2 days use the term crisis pregnancy center or crisis pregnancy. First of all, the pregnancy centers, you should be talking to them as a pregnancy resource center, because that's really what they are. They're a resource for any girl who's in that state. But then when you hear someone who's pregnant, it's not a crisis pregnancy. It's not even an unplanned pregnancy. Here's a new phrase for you. If every child is a blessing from, life is sacred from the moment of conception and natural death, then every child is a blessing, right? So in those circumstances, why don't you just call it an unexpected blessing?
Yes.
Unexpected blessing. Because the child is the blessing. Even in the rape and incest, the child is the innocent victim. So it's a blessing. It's the circumstances surrounding the pregnancy that have to be dealt with. And that can be dealt with. So try the phrase on for size about unexpected blessing. And do you give Mother's Day and Father's Day cards to people who the baby isn't born yet, but they're pregnant? They're already mothers and fathers. See, there's little things you could be doing to start injecting a more pro-life attitude in your community. If you hear Mrs. Jones or Miss Kid up the block, 15-year-old just became pregnant, what do you say? What's your response? Do you ask, what is she going to do? If you ask, what is she going to do, that's an abortion-minded question, because you're opening the door. Instead, your response is, oh, that's wonderful. All right, you weren't expecting it. It's an unexpected blessing. What can I do to help?
Right.
Yeah. You understand? So these are little things you can leave here with to make a more life-affirming responses to the everyday things that you're dealing with.
And just one more thought on my part, with a lot of these bioethical questions, people on the other side will say, what's the matter with you Christians? I thought you were pro-life, you're in favor of life, you're trying to stop abortion, and here we are trying to create life, and you're saying no to that too, Solution, the answer to that is an insight that we already know, but we have to articulate to them. And it's that, look, children are a gift. And that means they can neither be discarded nor demanded. Think about that.
Yeah.
They cannot be discarded, abortion and infanticide, whatever. But neither can they be demanded. Technically speaking, nobody has a right to a child. This is not, I want to create a book, I want to build a house. I don't have a right to a child. A child's a gift. I can ask the Lord for the gift, and I can do those things that normally bring about that gift, but I cannot demand and therefore cannot create. Because as soon as you start trying to create, then you're treating the human being as if it were a product. Child is a gift, can neither be discarded nor demanded.
And if people really want a child, you can adopt a child and he'll grow up to be just like him.
That could be good and bad.
Yeah.
Just a few tumultuous years, that's all.
I'm
joking.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. We're going to have to wrap this up now, but thank you so much.